the topic is pretty important and sad. But that is exactly why we were motivated to do this research, because there's a lot of works, empirically showing the effect of mass media on political outcomes, and mostly concerning the effects of voting in more or less relatively functioning democracies. But what is also happening is that you often see that leaders that come to power through the democratic process then later on use these powers basically to change the institutional structure and become like dictators and dismantle basically democracies. And the question is that basically trying to understand how the future dictators, often in these cases, actually they announce their intentions to change institutions, like in case of Hitler, like previously becoming elected. So basically, voters who vote, they more or less like rationally should anticipate that it should lead to institutional change. So the big like motivating question is like, how do these future dictators persuade voters to support them, and basically what is the role of propaganda and mass media in bringing these dictators or not bringing them to power, and then after coming to power and consolidating their position and basically persuading population to support their policies in the dictatorial regime. And basically just to get like some guidance, like what to expect, what are the main results that we will obtain, is basically we will, in the context of Nazi rising to power, we will show that the control over mass media actually played an important, not completely like determined, not the overwhelming, but important role in first actually preventing Nazis from coming to power, while the mass media was in the hands of more centrist powers. And then after the mass media, like radio, becomes controlled by Hitler, it played an instrumental role in them completely consolidating regime, getting elected, dismantling democracy, and then actually was instrumental in making people support their policies and implement like anti-Semitic violence in Germany in the 30s. But there, especially for the results, what is especially important for the results on the support of these anti-Semitic policies, what we observe is that there's a huge heterogeneity of the effects. So if you use measures of like predisposition, basically measures of historical anti-Semitism and some alternative measures, like how predisposed were people susceptible to these messages of being engaged in anti-Semitic violence, you see that if people priors were close to the message of the propaganda, so basically initially were kind of predisposed to anti-Semitic policies, their propaganda works big time. It becomes much more effective if the message of the propaganda is aligned with the predisposition of the listeners. However, if the predisposition of the listeners is like not aligned, if they initially, like we'll show, basically they kind of more or less tolerant to Jews, actually propaganda can backfire. Not only it's not just ineffective, it's counter-effective. So basically, if the people were not predisposed to the message, the more they were exposed to propaganda, the less likely they were to be engaged in anti-Semitic violence. So that will be like one of the important challenges, like results. So, but like why we look at Nazi Germany? I mean, I think it's doesn't require like big of motivation, but big why we think it's important context. I mean, it's really like one of the contexts in which arguably, and by historical evidence, mass media played a role in like one of the like most important historically, at least in 20th century, changes in institutional changes that led to like very serious consequences, and basically because there's so much anecdotal evidence on the role of propaganda, and especially radio propaganda in what happened in the 30s in Germany. This basically, historically, the whole kind of mass media studies, they were if you look historically, like how they were motivated, like this whole field was motivated trying to understand what happened in Germany in the 30s. But actually, even the early studies of like Lazarsfeld, etc., on mass media and the historical kind of evidence on what was going on, they're kind of unclear. Like, did really radio and propaganda played such a big role, or it was kind of actually it was kind of epiphenomenal thing, so like not, without any causal relationship. And well, obviously, like if you look like diaries of Goebbels, like he thought that it was extremely important. He, like, if you read his diaries, like he was very stressing that much that without radio, without propaganda, they would not be ever able to achieve what they have achieved. But he was kind of biased in his view, because like obviously he was the chief of propaganda. He wanted like to stress it, like that was a role, and that was important. But there are like historical evidence, like Sommervey and Zimmermann, they actually put in doubt very much this role of radio and propaganda, basically arguing that it was happening for different fundamental reasons, and radio was not very instrumental in achieving these goals. So basically, our main motivation is to see whether there was really a causal effect of radio there, and whether we see any evidence. And again, like some historical evidence was showing that at least Nazis themselves, they thought that radio was and propaganda for radio was playing a big role. That's why, like, basically that they had a lot of advertising promoting the listenership to the radio, and they promoting this culture of all the families listening to the radio as a kind of their connection with their leader. So they introduced this, like we'll be talking about later, like people's radio, so like to promote and really like to make sure that everyone gets this radio. They promote this was a kind of like picture of ideal German family, with a lot of like all the family listening to the radio. Like the head of the family, the father, also reading newspapers that were giving information about the policy. So basically, the Nazi leadership was actually playing a lot of, doing a lot of effort to make sure that people consume as much the news as possible. So they were clearly thinking that this literature is important. So basically, in general, like in fitting into literature, basically. We think that we contribute to the literature by first like looking at the effect of propaganda, not in like democratic context, but in the dictatorial regimes, and looking basically at extreme, kind of really extreme outcomes, because like they're similar to like what probably the only work so far that was doing this. This was work by David Niegazawa Draft on mass killings in Rwanda. But so we want to look at in the same context. The all chain of events, like voting and support or this extreme nationalistic policies. So basically, to give historical context, like in the 20s, radio was a new media, as like books in 16th century. It was really like the new media, and it was developed first in Germany and in the US. The difference was that in the US it was completely decentralized. In Germany it was very much centralized. So there was some variation in content, because like Germany was divided in nine regions, and there were 9 regional radio stations with slightly different content, tailored to local taste. But all the news production was centralized from the start. So all the news were produced by state postal company Reichspost. So there was very much control. And after in 1933, when Nazis came to power, everything became like completely centralized and ruled from Berlin. So basically, for the purpose of our analysis, we will all be treating like radio in Germany as providing like more or less the same content. We'll be looking at changes over time, but There was we will assume that it's like the same for all the Germany. So basically, historically, what was happening is that it first developed and was deliberately apolitical. So it was used to, they had like lectures, educational programs, classical music. It was viewed as very paternal, like you can read it, a very paternalistic view of educating people through radio. But then things, and basically almost like I saw evidence, almost no politicians were allowed on the radio, even like with occasionally giving, allowing the president of the country to appear, but basically no politicians. But in 1929, the situation changed a lot because the right-wing forces, including Nazis, initiated the so-called like a referendum, basically that the idea was to make the Versailles Treaty arrangements with making reparations completely illegal, basically to shut this forum down. And it was like this initiative was surprisingly popular. They were able to allow to attract like to signatures of like 10% of the electorate, which is like huge. Was required to initiate the referendum. So it was surprising for the government how popular became like right-wing forces, and they realized that they need to do something, and they changed. In particular, they changed their approach to radio programming. And they allowed political content that would promote the policies of the government first. And basically, they allowed all political parties to represent their views on radio, except for the extremists, both on the left side and the right side. So basically, the only two parties that were excluded were NSDAP on the right side and communists on the left side. So like all the moderates were allowed in, all the extremists were out. And this happened. This situation was in place until the end of January in 1933, when Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. Until that time, there is like actually like bias by omission, bias against Nazis, and then it changes completely after Hitler becomes Chancellor, and radio becomes like heavily biased in favor of NSDAP. Basically for 5 weeks until the next elections, and we'll see like it's still even like this 5 weeks of exposure have an important effect. But basically, in the end, there will be 3 periods, and we'll be exploiting this change in the context of that being completely apolitical, then becoming anti-Nazi, and then become pro-Nazi. And to basically document, so there's a lot of historical evidence on this, but we collect more direct measures. So we don't have transcripts of like the content of the radio broadcasts, so like what we're talking about. But we have what is like detailed data on the programming, like who on which time, like who was appearing, what was the program. So we're basically using this information. We can count the number of appearances of politicians. So any member of any politician appearing officially on the radio. So first, we document that it was indeed almost completely apolitical until 1929. There were almost no appearances of the politicians. If you see like appearances of politicians, it was a president appearing on the radio. Then things change actually in the end of 1929, and it's like you see like much more politicians appearing on radio. So it became political. But what is important also is that the mixture of politicians, who was allowed, was very different, was changing in this period, because basically like between 29 it's irrelevant because there were no politicians. After 29 you can see like almost there's no NSDAP people appearing. The people from the government governing parties, a lot of centrist parties. There was in July 1932, because like Von Papen wanted to establish some connections with NSDAP, he allowed like 3 appearances of NSDAP people before elections of 1932, but then it kind of didn't work out, his relationship with NSDAP. He again like completely banned them during the next election. So basically, until the end of 1932, until Hitler becomes Chancellor, almost no appearances of NSDAP people, any representative of NSDAP on the radio, and it becomes completely different after in these 5 weeks between like Hitler becoming chancellor and basically the last normal democratic elections in Germany at that time. And it's like Hitler himself made like 16 appearances during this 5 weeks. It's like heavily biased in favor of an SDAP. And we will be exploiting first this change in content, and second the variation in availability of radio, because it was like at that time it was like expanding big time. So and it was like, as you can see on this picture, the number of listeners of radio, for which we have like a proxy. We don't have real numbers of like listeners, but in Germany at that time, everyone who was listening to radio was supposed to pay subscription fee. It was not, it was more like now BBC, like it's not that when you buy radio you have to pay tax. It's actually only if you listen, and it was kind of enforced by fining people who don't. And it's Germany, so people were kind of abiding by that. So there were like there was like evidence there was some evasion, but actually it looks like it's a good proxy for the amount of listeners. Although like it's clearly like upper bound, lower bound on the number of listeners. First, because there was still some evasion. Some people didn't pay the subscription. Second, some groups of people were allowed not to pay, like if they were like veterans or something, and Nazis then expanded this number of groups who were allowed not to pay. And third, they encouraged big time like the collective listenership. So basically, it was like one radio subscription per family. They were like in family, like several people, and they actually encouraged like collective listenership on the workplace, in cafes, and like actually special radio clubs. So this is when we will be talking about magnitudes. This is becomes like will be important that one subscription represents several listeners. So basically, what we know is we can get from archives information on all the transmitting towers, their power, when it was changing, when they were closed for innovation, they were open, any changes, all the location of all transmitters and changes in their in the power of these transmitters for the whole period. So basically, for the whole period, we have a panel data on the radio signal strength for every point in Germany. And we also, for 3 years, we have regional data on the subscription fee. So we can use like more kind of IVs methodology to get closer to magnitudes for subscribers. So we'll be using both this information from expansion of radio and the availability of radio signal strength, and we'll be exploiting this change in content 3 times to 3 periods. We can show holding constant radio signal strength, and we can we'll talk about. I'll mention identification sometimes later, but obviously we control. We clearly understand that the positioning of towers were not random. I mean, they were explicitly trying to position towers where they have more densely populated areas. So we do as much as possible to control for dispersible determinants of the position of radio, including like city dummies, flexible control for population, distance to big cities. So it's all these confounds, including this like newspapers and cinemas, etc. So like we'll be taking this into account, but mainly we'll be in the end controlling for all these observables, then relying on the changes in availability of radio, mainly like variation in the signal strength of the radio. And there were like big changes over this period, because you can see like starting from 28, it was still kind of mostly like good reception was concentrated in several urban areas. Then it expanded big time, and by the in the 30s, like most like all of Germany was actually had a very good reception of the signal. But we'll be also exploring these really changes between different elections, how in which regions they were suddenly getting access to radio or not, and you can see that this was also changing with like between like 30s, for example, the whole Prussian part was like now getting radio, and previously didn't have it. So we will be relying on these changes in signal strength as well. Changes, there are 2 types of changes. First, they build new tower, and second, then they increase the power of the new tower. And it was basically, but you can see it's determined by the same observables, basically. Like they just in the most densely populated urban areas, then they moved like to also to densely populated. So it's basically the same type of observables predict expansion and all this. We also will exploit, like to match again to get to try to control as much as possible this possible confounds of distance to big cities, this non-linearity of the function of how radio signal strength translates actually in the number of listeners, because this is kind of if you look at currently at like TV and FM reception in nowadays, it's very sharp, almost like a step function. It's like S-shaped. It's very sharp. At that point in time, for technological reasons, actually, because of AM transmission was not was very weak and technology was not yet developed, it was very noisy. So even this S-shaped function, which is known in this literature on radio transmission, was kind of not that sharp. It's not a threshold that so there was a lot of noise, but still, like you observe this S-shaped relationship between the signal strength and the number of listeners. So basically, like the better signal strength you have, the higher signal strength you have, the more people can listen to it, and so the more people will be buying radio sets, etc. Germany was also at that time very unstable. Democracy, so they had a lot of elections, which is bad for them, good for us. I mean, we have a lot of observations. We really have like with a lot of parliamentary elections, presidential elections, etc., and all the interesting elections happening at this time, and they were happening in all three, basically, these different periods. If you divide this into three periods based on like radio bias in the content. So we'll have a number of measures during the period in which there was no bias in radio, but the radio was already expanding. Then there will be several elections in the time when there was anti-Nazi bias in radio. And then after the radio becomes biased in support of NSDAP, we will have like basically one fair election. There was still elections, but they were like 99% turnout with 99% of people voting for NSDAP, so it's not very interesting. But we will have measures of that more related to expression of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence, which will kind of more extreme outcomes, and we'll also use the kind of number of people who are becoming members of NSDAP at that point as well. So, but basically, we'll look at these three different periods in time, and essentially we'll use this pretty simple like first differences if kind of specification, which will just change in the votes for NSDAP between these elections and previous elections. How it depended on the signal strength or on predicted number of listeners based on this nonlinear transformation function. So that will be the main specification. We will also show you. I'll also show you the results based, like basically this electoral district, like smallest unit, fixed effects, where we will be identifying everything only through the changes in radio content and radio expansion. So without not exploiting cross-sectional variation, but only panel variation over time of exposure to radio. And the first set of results is like the simplest result. Basically, we look at how election, the number of share of votes that NSDAP got these elections as compared to previous elections changed as a function of radio signal strength at this electoral district level, where like we have like almost like 1,000 district levels, and we control like for 35 higher level electoral districts. They capture regional effects, and basically what we see is that after like in this 2 years between 28, so the previous election between elections of 28 and 1930, in regions in which they got they had stronger radio signal strength, with the radio becoming a biased, anti-Nazi bias with actually, again, but more for understanding it, is like bias by omission. Everyone was allowed this SF1 as DAP. So it was like actually not like heavy propaganda, but you still see that there's like actually quite significant effect that it led to significantly less votes going for an SDAP. But what you see is that when it became anti-Nazi, you have strong effect. It looks like there's no dynamic effect. It like stays there, so it's like step function, doesn't like then increase. So in 30s, you don't observe these effects. But again, when you see a change in content in the opposite direction, becoming pro-Nazi, you see that this like the effect completely like changes the sign, becomes like positive, significantly positive. So the more exposure to radio you had, the more votes were going to an SDAP. And so you can do the same using like the same results getting from like basic IV specification, which use like subscription, numbers of subscription as a kind of endogenous variable, signal strength as a exogenous like instrument. So, but that is kind of robust to using the different specification. So, in terms of magnitudes, what you see is that in the 30s, like we can basically compute counterfactual of like putting radio like signal strength to 0. What would happen if you had no access to radio? And we predict that Nazis basically would get like 5.4 percentage points more in these elections, which would put them back in 1930. They would have gotten almost exactly the same number as the first, like as SPD, which was the leading party at that time. So obviously and historically, it's hard to say what would have happened, but clearly it would like increase the bargaining position of the right wing for back then, and arguably it could like basically bring Nazis to power three years earlier than what happened. And in the 33 with pro-Nazi bias, basically you can explain, radio explains about a third in the change of votes between 30 and 33. So it's sizable, but again, interpretation, it's sizable effect, but probably Goebbels was not fully kind of right when saying that was like what like propaganda was the main thing that brought them to power. It was important, but not, it's not explaining like everything there. So to get at this we will like spend a lot of time thinking about the dynamic implications. It's not clear how it would work. So what we also do, we basically we show the results if we fix the signal penetration at as it was in 28, 30, 32, 33, and we look at the effects of this counterfactual signal penetration in different elections. So basically, here you fix the signal strength, and you identify everything only from the change in content, basically. And here you can see, but basically, if it was only like if signal penetration was completely random, you would see that the kind of the correct specification, which you use in 30, the signal strength of, from 1930 should be the strongest. Everything, all the other kind of effects should be smaller, just because I mean, you mismeasure now. You put into treatment group parts, some regions that were actually in control, and the other way around. You actually don't see it. So for 30s, it looks like in the expansion in these years was slightly biased towards regions that were not supporting an SDAP anyway. It looked like our interpretation. Why we don't see the big difference between these effects? So it really we don't know why we don't observe dynamic effects. So it looks like the most important was like when it was first introduced. Maybe because like people realized that after a certain amount of time they realized that the news are biased and started discounting them. So people who were already persuaded in the 1930s, they stayed persuaded, but you could not persuade new people because they already knew what to expect. And then again in 33, because it was unexpected change in the opposite direction again, you see that there's a persuasion effect. So maybe that can explain why you don't see this dynamic effects. These results also, like they show that like basically even if you fixed signal strength, you still observe the significant effects in 33 and 30, meaning that the effect is not just driven by signal expansion of the signal. It's part of it really comes from the change in the content in the 30s and in 33, which is important, like to base our basic identification assumption. And so this is one kind of argument in favor that it's like not fully driven by endogeneity of the expansion of radio. And we also to support our identification concerns, we also do a lot of placebo tests. I mean, nothing is like before 28, before it became political. Like we don't see an effect of anything. Any political vote for any political party, turnout, violence, just criminal violence. Anything. Like it's kind of no effect whatsoever. Don't observe it. We also do this tests in the spirit of Alton Elder Taber to provide some evidence that it was not driven by unobservables, and I like this assuming that observables are positively correlated with unobservables. We just predict the signal strength using observable characteristics of the places, took this predicted part, put it instead of signal strength, see no results for any of these effects. We tortured this a lot and like see nothing there, so I would assume it will work the other way around, but I would assume that we'll still have like pretty large standard errors, so we cannot exclude it. Like, at least there's no evidence that they are driving. And again, in the paper we have this like additional controls one by one, and you can see like the R square of controls grows from like 0.05 to 60 or 70%, and the coefficients are really like almost not changing. Like they're really stable. So it gives us hope that it's really not driven by observables. And finally, what we also can do, we can control basically for fixed effects of these like smallest regions, so these 1,000 regions, and identify the effects only solely through like expansion of radio signal, changing context, so taking into account all the like dynamic unobservable characteristics of these places, and we see that in this period where there was not change in contents, so you actually see that the expansion was leading to less votes going for Nazis. So this picture on what you don't see anything on this graph, like colored graphs, was not fully kind of there. It's probably because of endogeneity of the expansion that you don't see. That if you control, you see that even in the 30s, increasing the signal strength in your village, like town, was leading to less votes going for Nazi in this period. And this goes for like directly controlling for signal strength. You can use basic IV of like inverse differences. However you torture it, it tells you the same. But basically, I mean, again, these results support this notion that even if you even look only at the change of signal strength, it still goes through. So if you look only at the change in content, you can results go through. If you only look at the change in signal strength, it still go through. So it's like both channels where it worked. So, and we can use this basically to exploit the outcomes of number of different elections, so through voting for this referendum, presidential elections, still like the same idea. They're just the only kind of they're not as good because we don't have panel. It was like only one election, so we cannot subtract look at changes. But still, everything goes through. We can look at a bit more extreme outcomes. So basically, look at the right tail of distribution, like supporters of like really hardcore supporter of NSDAP, supporting them so much as to become like active member of NSDAP. So we know the information for the second half of the 32 and the first half of basically the beginning of the 33, and how it changes like with the change in content, and you can see that it didn't have any effect before January 30th, before Nazi came in power. So this anti-Nazi slant did not have any effect on the supporters of the NSDAP, like right tail, which I think it's logical. Actually, they are hardcore supporters, not like the radio. But when it became like really heavily for Nazi, pro-Nazi, actually it did shift even the right tail distribution. So it like, basically our interpretation is that those who were kind of moderate supporters by listening to the radio at that point became like really hardcore supporters and willing to become members. So it was shifting the distribution as well. So we have this result as well. But this is all for elections. So then, and how they came to power. What happened after they actually began came to power and tried to promote their policies. In particular, we were focusing on policies promoting anti-Semitism. So what we can do, we use the information from the paper by Joachim Voth and Nicole Voigtlander on the historical determinants of anti-Semitism, and we use exactly the measures that they used to measure anti-Semitism. In particular, 3 measures. First is a number of Jews deported from each city. So this is at the city level already. Number of Jews deported at city level, the number of letters to the main like NSDAP newspaper kind of denouncing Jews and writing how bad are Jews, so you can count the number of these letters coming from each city, and the dummy variable for whether the synagogue was destroyed during this crystal night, night of broken glass in 38, conditional on actually having synagogue. And you can see that the more exposure to radio you had during this period, the more likely you were to support this anti-Semitism measure. So it's significant for deportations and letters to Sturmer. It's not significant for the destruction of synagogues. Although, actually, we are a bit hesitant of the measure of synagogues because, historians, they disagree on how much local support was needed during this night of broken glass, and how much it was basically how much of it was top-down organized from Berlin, and regardless of local support, because radio increases local support. So for writing letters, you need local support. Even for deportations, you actually need local support because a lot of that, if you read historical evidence, was based on denunciations of Jews. So it measures local support. Synagogues, it's unclear because a lot of it is really centrally organized. So not clear how important it is. But to be fair, we report these results as well, and we show that basically the radio was important for that. For these policies as well. But what is kind of, we think, is a really kind of interesting finding, and to the best of our knowledge is novel, at least in terms of literature and mass media, is that we observed this variation in the strength of the effect of propaganda depending on the predispositions of the listeners towards the message of the propaganda. So in particular, we look at these anti-Semitic measures, and we use the measure, again, from the same paper by Joachim and Nico from Voth and Voigtlander, on historical anti-Semitism. So basically what they have in their paper is they show that the incidence of pogroms in 14th century during Black Death predict the anti-Semitic violence in the 30s. So basically, at the city level in Germany, they're arguing there's some historical anti-Semitism that goes back to the 14th century. So, and we use this measure as a kind of measure of historical cultural predisposition to the anti-Semitic measures. And we see that if you interact, that the effect of radio signal strength was much stronger in places in which they had Jewish settlement in 14th century, and there was a pogrom there. So it was historical anti-Semitic measure. So the sample size is much smaller because we only look, following their kind of work, we'll only look at the places in which they actually had a Jewish settlement in the 14th century. So basically, we divide cities. So here, an example of they all had Jewish settlement in 14th century, so they were exposed to Jews. In some of them, there were pogroms in 14th century, so were like historically anti-Semitic. Some they didn't have pogroms, which you may even interpret as historically kind of tolerant to Jews because they were exposed to them in 14th century and didn't have pogroms. Whereas the rest of what is missing from the sample are the places which didn't have any Jewish community in 14th century, so were less exposed to Jews to start with. But what is important is that, yes, in cities where the historical anti-Semitic cities, the effect was much stronger, but what is really, actually it was surprising for us, that in places where historically kind of tolerant to Jews, or exposed but no pogroms, the effect of radio is significant, goes in the opposite direction. The more propaganda, if you are basically historically not predisposed to the message of propaganda, the more propaganda the more you're exposed to propaganda, the less likely you are to follow the message in the propaganda. So our interpretation, actually, we were able to find evidence of backfiring, but in medical literature, in which when they only so far. I mean, that I really, if someone knows any evidence, empirical evidence of backfiring of this persuasion, please let us know, because we're desperately trying to find it. So far what we found is in vaccination. If you try to persuade people that vaccines are good, and give them the hard information actually that vaccines are good, and they're initially negatively predisposed to the vaccine, actually they become even less. And our interpretation is, and we're actually now working on a theoretical model of this, is basically you have asymmetry about two things. One is something like policy, how bad are Jews, and second is how biased is the sender of the message, basically, how crazy is it. It's by receiving the signal, you basically update on both. And if you are your predisposition is close to the message, you mainly update on the policy dimension. So, okay, the Jews are really bad. It looks like if you are at some threshold level, if it becomes really heavy propaganda, and you are not predisposed to this message, you mainly update and think, the guy is crazy. So everything that they say is completely wrong. And especially here in this context, in the context of medical things, I don't know how they read here. You can even interpret this that because they were also exposed to propaganda for newspapers and newsreels in the cinemas, it may be the case that this radio is the last bit of information. Now you say, oh no, they're completely crazy. Will not believe in any propaganda of these guys, including the propaganda from newspapers and newsreels. That's why we completely discount all other sources, information coming from the same sender. Okay, so basically this is the main thing. You can use other measures like vote for SFP and land inequality to measure this kind of predisposition, and actually it still works, but we think this historical is thing is the main mostly important. Actually, if you compare persuasion rate, they're actually in line with all the literature. It's like persuasion rates for positive message, vote for NSDAP. It has in our example this 11%, which is actually something that you find in literature. The negative message, don't vote for NSDAP, which was in place in 30s, is much more persuasive, but actually the same thing we found, for example, in Russia, that negative message, don't vote for someone, is much more persuasive than the message of do something, vote for this party. So it's actually consistent with the message. And technical thing is it depends, the actual magnitude of persuasion rate depends on this assumption how many people were per radio subscription we were using. So since we kind of really don't know well, we give the whole function. How the persuasion rate depends on on the number of subscriptions, and with a lot of placebo tests. But basically, in the end, the conclusion, what we find is that the radio was kind of important factor, but not the major driving force on first preventing Nazis from coming to power in 30s, not preventing, slowing down the advent to power. Then they became important in bringing them to power. And then they were important in consolidating power and promoting the policies of the NSDAP once it was a full dictatorship. But importantly, it also our results show this evidence on the limits of propaganda. Propaganda works big time if the message of propaganda is aligned with the predisposition of the listeners. If it's too far away from the predisposition, it can backfire completely. So it's not that you can persuade people to do whatever they want using mass media. There are limits.
It's only as much as you can do for propaganda. And I think it's the most important message. Okay, thanks a lot.